Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on a monumental figure and a text that really did change American history. Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Now, for many people, this is, just a required historical reading. It details a remarkable escape from bondage. But we know it's so much more than that.
It's far more, you can't just see it as a memoir of a physical escape. When you really get into the narrative, you have to see it as this foundational act of self-creation.
Yeah.
It's liberation, but it's achieved through the sheer disciplined force of words and intellect.
Right.
Douglass wasn't just recording history. He was actively engineering his own identity, moving himself from being defined as property to defining himself as a man.
That frames our goal perfectly, I think. We're moving past the simple geographical escape to focus on the intellectual liberation. So our mission today is to really extract the crucial insights from all our source material. That's excerpts from the narrative, biographical notes, some contemporary literary analysis, to show how literacy, resistance, and rhetoric were the true pathway from slavery to freedom.
We want to understand those profound, deliberate forces that sought to crush his selfhood, and then, on the other side, the meticulous strategies Douglass used to reclaim that selfhood and, ultimately rewrite his own destiny. Right there on the page.
And to really appreciate the scale of that achievement, I think we have to start with the sheer cold brutality of the system he was up against. The architecture of oppression, the calculated methods designed to just strip away personhood from day one.
We really have to begin with the most fundamental deprivation, what Douglass himself called the blank slate of his identity. He opens the narrative by stating, very plainly, that he had no accurate knowledge of his age, or his birthday.
And he immediately explains why, which is so telling about the mindset of the master class. He says that masters wanted to keep slaves ignorant of their age.
Right.
They saw them not as human beings with a history, but as property. Their birth date was as irrelevant as that of a horse.
That analogy, being equated to livestock, it's pivotal. It's everything. By denying them a birthday, a lineage, you're erasing the human concepts of time, of individuality, of legal status.
It's so systematic.
It is. White children could recite their ages perfectly, but for Douglass, anytime he even asked about his, it was seen as improper and impertinent.
And evidence of a restless spirit.
Exactly. The slaveholder knew that a sense of personal history was just completely incompatible with the condition of servitude. So the erasure of time is the systematic erasure of the self.
And that intentional systemic erasure extends immediately to his family connections. We learn about his mother, Harriet Bailey. She was hired out 12 miles away, and she only visited him at night. She would travel that entire distance on foot after her day's work was done.
It's this remarkable testament to a mother's dedication, but it's also proof of the system's absolute cruelty. The separation was intentional. It was designed to destroy natural affection.
Which it did. When she died, Douglass was only about 7.
And his reaction is just devastating, precisely because it proves the slaveholder's goal was achieved. He says he received the news of his mother's death with much the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger.
It's not apathy. It's the psychological outcome of a system that's designed to sever those innate bonds of love and kinship before they can even form.
And if destroying the mother-child bond wasn't enough, we then have to deal with what he calls the glaring odiousness of his own paternity.
The rumor.
The persistent rumor that his master, Captain Anthony, may have actually been his father.
Wait, so this wasn't just, casual adultery. This was the slaveholder administering to his own lusts and somehow making it, as Douglass puts it, profitable as well as pleasurable. How does that dynamic even work?
It works because the slaveholder sustains this double relation of master and father. Douglass observed that these mulatto children often suffered even greater hardship because they were a constant offense to their mistress. The mistress, consumed by jealousy and resentment, was always looking for a reason to find fault with them, to inflict a specific cruelty that she couldn't direct at her husband.
And the consequence of that hatred is just chilling. Douglass says that this resentment sometimes forced the master to sell his own children.
He does. And he notes, with this bitter, bitter irony, that this act, selling your own flesh and blood, was often the most humane thing the master could do for the child, because it was an escape from the mistress's special, focused cruelty.
It just shows you that the entire plantation home was a moral, psychological, and familial hellscape. There's no other word for it.
And that foundational trauma, the erasure of history, the contamination of family, It's then fully realized through his initiation into violence. Douglass calls it his entrance into the system, the blood-stained gate.
The scene with his Aunt Hester. This is the moment where childhood innocence is just irrevocably destroyed by this lawless theatrical violence. Douglass details how Captain Anthony tied her hands to a hook and a joist, so she's on her toes, strips her from the neck to the waist, and just slashes her back.
And he focuses on these visceral details, watching the warm red blood came dripping to the floor. It's a spectacle. It's an act of deliberate spectacle designed to terrorize any young slave who might be watching.
What I find most instructive is the arbitrary nature of the cruelty. He says Anthony would whip her to make her scream and then whip her to make her hush.
Stopping only when he was overcome by fatigue.
It wasn't about control, not really. It was about demonstrating absolute, unchecked, godlike power.
And the young Douglas's reaction is exactly the system's desired outcome. He was so terrified and horror-stricken that I hid myself in a closet. He truly believed he was going to be next.
And he names that experience, looking back, as the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass.
That's it. It's the gateway that transforms a boy into someone who understands he is living under a rule of pure terror.
But the narrative is also so keen to show that this system degrades everyone, including those who think they're on top of it.
Exactly. Douglass talks about the valuation and inspection process. Slaves are treated completely indistinguishably from livestock. They go through the same narrow examination.
The quote is just stunning. There were horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank in the scale of being. And then he adds, maids and matrons had to undergo the same indelicate inspection.
And that indelicate inspection showed Douglass, as he puts it, more clearly than ever the brutalizing effects of slavery upon both slave and slaveholder. It establishes the moral bankruptcy of the entire institution.
Right. Human life is just reduced to a quantifiable commodity value. And this commodification, it even distorted things that should have been perceived as a small privilege.
You're talking about the Great House Farm.
Yeah, Colonel Lloyd's estate, which was like the central administrative village. Slaves from the out farms thought running errands there was this high privilege.
And Douglass uses this seemingly minor detail to deliver a really profound social insight. He watches the slaves competing fiercely for this chance to run errands, and he says they sought to please the overseers, as the office seekers and the political parties seek to please and deceive the people.
That comparison is just stunning. It shows how the microsystem of the plantation mirrors the corruption of the entire political world.
It does. This desire for just a tiny bit of advancement, for proximity to power, it distorts into sycophancy and betrayal. They were internalizing the master's cruel competitive structure.
It proves that slavery wasn't just some historical anomaly. It's a deeply sophisticated, destructive social engine.
And if you needed any more proof of its cold economic logic, you just have to look at the fate of the aged.
This is where Douglass tells the story of his grandmother. She had served her whole life, from youth to old age. She had peopled his plantation with slaves. She'd even nursed her old master. She gave her entire productive life to this man.
But eventually, she was deemed of little value because of age and weakness. And her reward for all that service is the ultimate act of ingratitude. She's taken to the woods, given a little hut with a mud chimney, and virtually turned her out to die in total loneliness.
The imagery is heartbreaking. She was forced to watch the division of her children, her grandchildren, and great-grandchildren sold off like so many sheep.
After all that service, the system just discards her. It robs her of her family, her home, and any comfort in her last years. It's one of the most powerful condemnations he makes.
It proves that the entire system is ruled by economic calculus. There's no protection, no humanity, no loyalty, no matter how much service is rendered.
It sets the absolute lowest possible baseline for human worth.
So if that is the baseline erased identity, shattered family, lawless terror, and ultimate disposable value, then the intellectual transformation we're about to see is nothing short of a miracle of will.
The physical conditions of slavery were designed to create what Douglass calls a brute. And the moment that process starts to reverse is when he's 8 years old, sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld.
And this is where the power of environment gets tested, starting with Mrs. Auld. Sophia Auld was initially a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She'd been preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery because she had never actually owned a slave before. She treated Douglass like a human being, and she started teaching him the alphabet.
But this is where Douglass introduces one of his great rhetorical tools, the study of irony. He observes that the system of slavery acts like a literal, contagious moral poison. The fatal poison of irresponsible power quickly corrupted her.
Her heart turned to stone, her sweet voice to harsh and horrid discord, and her face to that of a demon.
That phrase, the fatal poison of irresponsible power, it suggests slavery was just as injurious to the moral character of the white population as it was to the bodies of the enslaved. It just destroyed her capacity for empathy.
And it is at this exact moment of instruction that this invaluable revelation occurs, and it comes from the master of the house, Hugh Auld. He finds out she's teaching him and forbids it immediately.
And in doing so, he spells out the entire philosophy of control. He basically gives Douglass the blueprint for his own freedom.
His specific words are just absolutely critical. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world,
Making him discontented and unhappy.
and forever unfit him to be a slave.
And you just see the monumental irony here. Auld intended to crush his spirit, but what he actually did was gift Douglass the key to his own intellectual freedom.
And Douglass's reaction to these words is one of the most important passages in the whole book.
It is. He realizes these words were a new and special revelation. It explained the white man's power to enslave the black man. The master's greatest fear suddenly became the slave's highest desire.
That's it. He realized the pathway from slavery to freedom was through knowledge.
This is the moment of cognitive liberation. If knowledge is the lock, he's resolved to learn whatever it takes. And since Mrs. Auld was now a corrupted agent of the system, he needed a new strategy.
So he turns the street into his classroom. He converts these little white boys on Philpott Street into his unwitting teachers, a brilliant strategy of just leveraging his environment.
And he uses another brilliant metaphor to describe this. He would carry bread with him, which he was often given freely, and he traded this physical sustenance to these hungry little urchins for what he called the more valuable bread of knowledge.
He's exchanging the ephemeral physical food for the enduring intellectual food of life.
That metaphor is so powerful because it establishes his priorities. The literal need for food is secondary to this profound hunger for literacy. But he had to do it all in total secrecy.
Which just underscores the danger.
He dared not give the boys names. Prudence forbids, he says, because teaching slaves to read was an unpardonable offense.
In a supposedly Christian country.
Right. The crime wasn't theft or violence. The crime was sharing knowledge, which confirms where the true threat to the system really lay.
This self-education really culminates when he's about 12 and gets his hands on a truly pivotal book, one that shapes his rhetoric and his political consciousness, The Columbian Orator.
This anthology was just instrumental. It gave him both the philosophical and the rhetorical tools to dismantle slavery. It had speeches, Sheridan's vindication of human rights, and crucially, a dialogue where a slave debates his master.
And what made that dialogue so impactful for him?
It didn't end with violence or escape. It ended with the slave arguing his master into submission. It resulted in the slave's voluntary emancipation. It was a template for victory through reason.
So he sees that words can be weapons.
Exactly. The effect on him was monumental. It gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, he writes. It enabled him to utter his thoughts and to meet the arguments that supported slavery with logic and rhetoric.
He moved from just feeling oppressed to understanding why and how to fight back.
But this knowledge brought immediate, profound agony. It was the price of being awake. This reading brought the precise discontentment that Hugh Auld had predicted. It revealed the horrible pit, but no ladder upon which to get out.
He says he envied the stupidity of his fellow slave.
He did, because in their ignorance, they were spared this exquisite pain of knowing their condition without knowing how to escape it. The silver trump of freedom had roused his soul to eternal wakefulness. It was torment.
What's fascinating, to bring in some literary analysis, is how this intellectual realization didn't just stay theoretical. The scholar Robert Steptoe argued that Douglass's quest can be focused into two specific, tightly bound terms.
Freedom and literacy.
Exactly. The two became interchangeable for him.
They're inseparable. The ability to read and write was crucial not just for understanding his situation, but for literal physical freedom. In his first failed escape attempt, Douglass literally writes a false pass for himself and for his co-conspirators.
He's translating intellectual mastery into physical possibility. Literacy wasn't just a comfort, it was a tool. A literal tool for writing his way out of slavery.
This intellectual liberation now has to be tested by an existential physical battle. After he gains this knowledge in Baltimore, he's sent back to the country. He's deemed unsuitable for Master Thomas Auld, which sets the stage for the crucial confrontation with the slave breaker.
Let's pause on Thomas Old for a second. Douglass calls him a mean man and an adopted slaveholder who was incapable of managing his slaves either by force, fear, or fraud. But what makes him so unique is his reliance on religious sanction for his cruelty.
The irony is just devastating. Auld, a devout Methodist class leader, finds religious justification for his cruelty by quoting the Bible, Luke 12:47.
He that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes.
And he uses that to justify whipping a lame slave named Henny.
So he's outsourcing his cruelty to God. This wasn't just individual meanness. It was using piety as a cloak for brutality. It's a theological condemnation of the whole Southern system.
Absolutely. And because Auld couldn't control Douglass, he hires him out to a man named Edward Covey.
The professional slave breaker.
The slave breaker, yes. Hired specifically for his high reputation for crushing the will of young, rebellious slaves. And Covey, too, was a devout religious man, a Methodist class leader, which, as Douglass notes, added weight to his reputation.
This juxtaposition of the most brutal men being the most religious class leaders is one of the narrative's most potent critiques of that institutional hypocrisy.
And Covey was effective. I mean, during those first 6 months, Douglass was worked past endurance. They were in the field from dawn until the last lingering ray had left us, and often midnight caught us in the field.
He says he was broken in body, soul, and spirit.
A man transformed into a brute. His natural elasticity was crushed. His disposition to read departed. This isn't a nearly won.
But Covey's methods went beyond just sheer physical labor. He was a specialist in psychological torture, which is how he earned the nickname, the Snake.
Covey's forte consisted in his power to deceive. Douglass believed Covey seemed to think himself equal to deceiving the Almighty. He maintained this sense of omnipresence by spying, crawling on his hands and knees like a snake, or pretending to leave before hiding in a fence corner to watch them.
That psychological warfare is crucial. By being constantly watched, they could never truly rest or relax. They never knew when the master might be lurking.
It creates an internal state of permanent anxiety and paranoia. It crushes the spirit before the whip even touches the skin.
And we can bring in some literary analysis here from Robert O'Mealy, who looked at Covey's name.
Right. O'Mealy notes that Covey comes from the French word cuvy, meaning brood or hatch, or the Latin cubere, which means to lurk or lie hid.
So his name itself signifies his hidden, lurking identity, like a snake or a deceptive mother bird watching his brood. It positions him as the ultimate trickster in the story.
But a trickster whom Douglass learns to defeat. The psychological breaking hits its climax when Douglass collapses from sickness while fanning wheat on a hot August day. He was just overwhelmed by the heat and the labor.
And Covey's reaction is not sympathy, it's savage violence. He finds Douglass under a fence, gives him a savage kick, and hits him on the head with a hickory slat, causing the blood to run freely.
At this moment, Douglass resolves to seek protection. He runs 7 miles to Master Thomas, covered in blood.
But Thomas Auld is utterly unsympathetic. He ridicules the danger, refuses protection, because he's terrified of losing the year's wages.
He just tells him to go back, threatens to whip him himself if he doesn't, and gives him a large dose of salts. Just treats him like an animal that needs a purge, not a person who needs refuge.
So wounded and disheartened, Douglass spends the next day hiding in the woods. He's at the absolute epitome of despair, but this is where he meets Sandy Jenkins.
Sandy Jenkins, the old advisor. He represents a connection back to a supportive Black community and this kind of ancient folk wisdom. He gives Douglass a certain root.
The root is this fascinating, almost magical element in the story. Sandy tells him to carry it on his right side and claims it'll make it impossible for Covey or any white man to whip him.
And Douglass explicitly states that he initially rejected it. He thought it was superstition, a product of ignorance, but he took it to please him.
And what's fascinating is the immediate psychological effect. When he goes back to Covey's on Sunday morning, Covey speaks to him very kindly and goes off to church.
So whether the root had actual power is irrelevant. The fact that he was carrying it changed his psychological state. It restored his sense of self-belief, or at least a sense of external protection. It was the confidence booster he needed.
And that confidence is immediately tested on Monday morning.
It is. Covey catches Douglass in the stable with a long rope, planning a beating. And when Covey seizes his legs to tie him, the intellectual man, the man who read the Columbian Orator, transforms into the physical man.
He says, "From whence came the spirit, I don't know. I resolve to fight." And then that simple, profound statement. He seized Covey by the throat, and as he did, I rose.
That phrase, I rose, is the central act of self-resurrection in the narrative. It's so much more than just getting to his feet. It is the physical manifestation of the intellectual rebirth that started with Hugh Auld's revelation.
And the battle that followed lasted 2 hours. 2 hours. Douglass made Covey bleed, he kicked his helper, and he utterly defeated the slave breaker.
And crucially, another slave named Bill refused to help Covey. He just stated he was hired to work, not to whip.
Bill's refusal turns this from a personal fight into a moment of communal resistance.
It does. And Douglass's victory inspired not only himself, but provided this silent public moment of solidarity. The profound result is in that famous line, "This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave." He called it a glorious resurrection, from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom.
His long-crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, and the ultimate validation: he was never whipped again in the 4 remaining years of his bondage.
And why did Covey let this pass unpunished? His professional reputation as a Negro breaker was at stake. To publicize that a 16-year-old boy had successfully fought him off would have destroyed his entire economic reason for being.
Douglass's manhood was asserted, physically, publicly, and validated by the very system that tried to crush him.
Having achieved that physical and intellectual manhood, Douglass now starts to analyze the more subtle, rhetorical forms of control and resistance. He realizes the battle for freedom has to be waged on the cultural front, too. And he starts this analysis with the deep meaning of slave songs.
This is such a powerful correction to Northern complacency. In the North, a lot of people just misunderstood the singing of slaves as evidence of their contentment.
Right, happy slaves. Douglass just sharply corrects this. He says it is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake.
He explains that slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs represent the sorrows of his heart and are a form of relief, only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears.
They were these wild, melancholy sounds, sometimes ending in screams and just inexpressible grief. He contrasts that northern perception with his reality. The songs were a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance.
He traces his first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery to those wild notes. They were complex cultural forms carrying deep, unarticulated political truth.
And this capacity to read cultural symbols to understand the hidden meaning beneath the surface is a direct result of his literacy. He does the same thing with the holidays. He exposes the systemic fraud inherent in those celebrations.
He calls the holidays, especially the time between Christmas and New Year's, a gross fraud and the result of selfishness. He argues they were explicitly designed to disgust slaves with freedom.
How did they achieve that?
Through enforced dissertation. The slaveholders would provide huge amounts of whiskey and encourage heavy drinking, gambling, and wallowing in filth. They were given total license for a few days to engage in extreme vice.
It's a devastating psychological critique. He says the cunning slaveholder cheats the slave, who asks for virtuous freedom, with a dose of vicious dissipation, artfully labeled with the name of liberty.
The political goal was clear. When the holidays were over, the slaves would stagger up, sick, exhausted, feeling physically miserable, and they'd feel rather glad to go back to the arms of slavery.
The masters successfully made them think there was little difference between the chaos of liberty and the security of servitude. It taught them to associate self-governance with total disorder.
This manipulation just reinforces the necessity of what he calls the mask of contentment for survival. If the masters were this cunning, slaves knew they could never be truthful about their condition.
They almost universally say they are contented when asked by whites, mainly because of the constant immediate danger of spies and informers. You could never trust who was listening.
And Douglass gives that chilling anecdote that enforces this rule. The story of the slave who truthfully told Colonel Lloyd, without realizing who he was, that he was worked too hard and given poor food.
And the consequence was swift and brutal. The slave was immediately chained and sold to a Georgia trader without a moment's warning. That single tragedy established the universal maxim among the slaves: a still tongue makes a wise head.
Duplicity, silence, strategy. These became essential tools for survival. And this strategy was also essential during his failed escape attempt. When they were caught, the crucial command Douglass gave his friends was, own nothing.
Admit nothing. Rely on collective silence as the best defense. He learned that rhetoric and resistance were sometimes best accomplished through total strategic silence.
Finally, we get to his successful escape in 1838. His growing awareness of injustice fueled this profound restlessness. He saw the reward of his own toil being poured into his master's purse.
And even the little encouragement money he sometimes got only struck him as an admission that he had a right to the whole thing.
So he tried to create a space of semi-freedom first. He negotiated an arrangement with Hugh Auld where he would hire his time, paying Auld $3 a week and then covering all his own expenses on top of that.
And Douglass fully understood this was a hard bargain. He says it gave Auld all the benefits of slaveholding without its evils, while he, Douglass, suffered all the care and anxiety of a free man. But it was a necessary step. It was a training ground for independence.
But he lost that privilege. He stayed out late one Saturday night to attend a camp meeting. And Hugh Auld, enraged, realized the next logical step would be running away, so he immediately revoked the privilege.
And that reversal prompted Douglass to resolve upon September 3rd, 1838, for his final escape. And here we see a final, profound act of political rhetoric right in the narrative itself. He intentionally suppresses the details of how he escaped.
Why is that suppression so significant? It frustrates the reader's curiosity, but he does it to avoid closing any avenue by which a brother slave might clear himself.
It is a deliberate political act. He preferred that the tyrant remain profoundly ignorant of the means of flight. He refused to hold the light by which the tyrant could trace the footprints of a flying brother.
So his personal narrative is consciously subordinated to the greater goal of communal liberation. He writes his story, but keeps the crucial instructions secret, the ultimate act of rhetorical strategy.
The physical escape to New York was successful, but the arrival was marked by this profound loneliness and fear. He had won the physical battle, but he was still completely disoriented.
He was in the midst of thousands, and yet a perfect stranger, fearing money-loving kidnappers. His initial motto in the North was the deeply painful, "Trust no man."
He saw in every white man an enemy, and in almost every colored man a cause for distrust, because of the constant threat of betrayal.
Thankfully, he was quickly helped by David Ruggles, a crucial African-American abolitionist, and it was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, that the final most crucial act of self-creation occurred, the renaming.
He went through several names, Frederick Bailey to Stanley, then Frederick Johnson, before settling on Frederick Douglass. This insistence on choosing his own name is the culmination of his journey from property to person.
He insisted on keeping Frederick to preserve a sense of my identity, and the name Douglass was suggested by his friend Nathan Johnson, inspired by the Scottish chieftain Lord James of Douglas in Sir Walter Scott's poem Lady of the Lake.
That literary connection just cements his transition. He moves from a commodity marked by his owner's name to a self-determined hero marked by a literary tradition.
What's truly fascinating is the immediate contrast between his slave-instilled expectations of the North and the prosperous reality he finds in New Bedford. The South had taught him a foundational lie.
An ideological lie. He'd been told that non-slaveholding Northerners were exceedingly poor, that they lacked wealth and refinement because they didn't have slaves. He was expecting a rough, hard-handed, and uncultivated population.
But the truth just shattered that myth immediately. He found New Bedford to be clean, new, beautiful. None of the dilapidated houses with poverty-stricken inmates that characterized the slave states.
And he was most astonished by the condition of the free black community. He found many who had not been free for 7 years living in finer houses than the average of slaveholders in Maryland.
He highlights Nathan Johnson, the man who gave him his name. Johnson was a working man, a simple tradesman, but he took and read more newspapers and better understood the nation than 9/10 of the slaveholders back in Talbot County.
It just proved that wealth and wisdom did not depend on the barbaric institution of chattel slavery.
But despite this prosperity, he quickly found that prejudice still existed. White caulkers refused to work with him, forcing him to work as a day laborer, sawing wood, shoveling coal for nearly 3 years.
Freedom was real, but equality was not yet achieved.
The transition from fugitive to orator really accelerates once he starts reading William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator.
It gave him a correct idea of the movement. He now had the platform and the cause for which his entire intellectual journey had prepared him.
He spoke publicly for the first time at the Nantucket Convention in August 1841. He felt a severe cross and great hesitancy speaking to white people, but he quickly found a degree of freedom in the moment.
And Garrison was so impressed by his natural eloquence that he called Douglass a prodigy. He hired him on the spot as an anti-slavery speaker. This is the moment where the intellectual freedom and the physical escape synthesize into a public political force.
And this leads directly to the 1845 publication of the narrative,
Which became an immediate sensation, but it came at a great cost. It jeopardized his freedom by exposing his identity, forcing him to tour England and Ireland until friends could purchase his freedom in 1846. The book that made him famous also made him a target.
The book itself performed so many essential functions. It succeeded as an unassailably reliable record of slavery from the viewpoint of the enslaved.
Right. It was written with such precise language and measured tone that the proponents of slavery, who were desperate to declare him a fraud, couldn't refute it. It became a self-authenticating narrative.
It's a rhetorical masterpiece. His entire life, which he summarized in his third autobiography, was a testament to transformation. He said he lived several lives in one. First, the life of slavery, and fifthly, the life of victory. If not complete, at least assured.
The book is the argument for his humanity.
And that argument is structurally perfect. The whole architecture of the book reflects the literary device of chiasmus, a verbal reversal. It mirrors his reversal of fortune from property to person.
The chiasmus is key. It's the rhetorical mirror image. The system tries to make a man a slave, but the result is that the slave is made a man. It's a perfect reversal of power.
And that's the perfect way to encapsulate the journey from Covey's stable to the speaker's podium. The most powerful example is that declaration at the heart of the whole work. You've seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man.
That sentence is the thesis of the entire narrative. It reflects his whole mission to undermine and reverse the system of power relations, to show the master as the real slave, a slave to greed, cruelty, liquor, and to position the slave as the true free man, intellectually and morally superior.
This deep dive into Frederick Douglass's narrative really reveals that his journey to freedom wasn't just geographical. It was a calculated, intellectual, and rhetorical war against a system designed to crush his very identity.
The system tried to impose a blank slate, but his pursuit of literacy transformed that slate into an unassailable weapon.
The knowledge he gained from that crucial revelation by Hugh Auld to the rhetorical models in the Columbian Orator was the silver trump that roused his soul to eternal wakefulness.
And that intellectual foundation then gave him the courage for the physical turning point, the fight with Covey, his glorious resurrection to manhood.
And his literary legacy is rooted in this commitment to being a public witness, using words not just to describe oppression, but to dismantle the myths that sustained it, exposing the lies beneath the slave songs and the cruel deceit of the holidays.
One of the early critics, Margaret Fuller, noted that despite the horrifying facts, Douglass's view of those who injured him was just and temperate. He displayed a moral restraint that was itself an argument for his humanity. This highlights the power of the narrative as a self-authenticating document. Its truth, delivered with measured authority, is its greatest strength.
So if Douglass's entire struggle, documented with such precise language and truth, was about reversing that system of power relations, showing the master as slave and the slave as the free man, then you have to consider, what are the hidden systems of control and deception in your own life that only a radical act of self-defined truth like Douglass's can expose and reverse? What lie are you currently living that only literacy or an assertion of will can defeat?